Welcome to this program on the Lewis Brothers Lumber Company on Barclay Mountain. This is Matt Carl from LeRoy Heritage Museum, and today we're going to talk about the history of the Lewis Brothers operation and all of the many things that they did. I've presented this program in the past, but I've elaborated on it for this video in order to cover many of the major things that were done by the Lewis family. The Lewis brothers are the family who built the hotel that the LeRoy Heritage Museum is now converting into its new museum. Because of that interesting connection to the mountain and what is going on now with the building, it's a good time to talk about the history of this family. So we need to begin by talking about the history of lumbering before Laquin. Many times we talk about the town of Laquin, and some people might get the impression that that's the only time lumbering was done on the mountain. But in fact, lumbering had been going on Barclay Mountain for several years before Laquin came along. So let's go back and look at some of the earliest known sawmills in the area and discuss what was going on in the area leading up to the start of Laquin. So we're looking at a map now that was created by Samuel Rhodes in 1835. Mr. Rhodes was the land agent for the Barclay family. The Barclays lived in England, and Mr. Rhodes came here to map out the Barclays' land. They had purchased this land as an investment. They were Quakers and really didn't know what they owned. Previous land agents had not really taken care of the property and what was going on there. And so Mr. Rhodes was creating this map to show what he had found on his trip in 1835. The interesting thing about this map is that along the Towanda Creek, which is shown in the top part of the map, you can see notations made there along the creek where LeRoy would be today. Now on this map, LeRoy Township wasn't quite formed yet. LeRoy was formed in 1835, and it's the same year as this map was created. But you'll see at this time, LeRoy wasn't on there yet. You'll see Canton Township and Franklin Township mentioned. LeRoy was taken from Canton and Franklin both, so approximately where that dividing line is where LeRoy is today. But along the Towanda Creek, you'll see notations that say mills, and it's all the way up the creek. Now that could be any sort of mill, sawmill, grist mill, or whatever, but these are all along the Towanda Creek. And I have to believe that it's probably referring more to sawmills, because he makes a notation in his report that he furnished along with the map that said the Towanda Creek was, quote, navigable for arcs, flat-bottom boats, and for rafts when the waters are high, end quote. And that's written there right on the map in the borders of the Towanda Creek. So that is an interesting detail, and one of the only evidences that I've ever found of the Towanda Creek being used as a highway, as it's described in Kraft's 1878 History of Bradford County. They called it a highway for the transportation of timber and logs and lumber and whatever floating on rafts when the water was high. It's hard to imagine that today, considering how low the Towanda Creek is and how filled in it is compared to those earlier days. But nevertheless, the Towanda Creek was an important part of transporting lumber out of the area back then and logs out of the area. So in LeRoy alone, there were various sawmills, and so I'll point out some of those here. There's an aerial view of LeRoy as it is today, and in this picture I've identified where some of those sawmills and a planing mill and other mills were located in LeRoy. And this is why it's called Mill Street. The only street in the center of LeRoy is called Mill Street because there were so many mills there on the street. So first of all, Hugh Holcomb built a sawmill at the top of the falls in the Gulf Brook in 1808. Hugh was the first settler, along with his brother Sterling. And the top of the falls in the Gulf Brook, you can see identified on the map. And at the top of the falls is right in the trees there. And right there along the bank would have been the first sawmill that provided the lumber to build some of the early framed houses in LeRoy. Down on Mill Street, Amos Harris built a sawmill on land his father had purchased in 1848. And his land today is the LeRoy Community Grounds, the Heritage Museum, and the LeRoy Independent Baptist Church, which all sit on land that was once owned by the Harris family. And they had their mills They're down at the location of the lower ball field today on the flats. And also, Rancy Morse would later purchase a portion of the Harris property in 1893 and partner with James A. Shedden to build a planing and cider mill. And that is located, or was located, out behind where the pavilion on the community grounds is. When I say behind, I mean to the west of the pavilion. He later sold the mill to Z.T. Fellows and Clarevale Holcomb in 1900, and it was remodeled into a shingle mill. And so a lot of lumber production in one way or another went on there on Mill Street. Now, the Holcomb Mill and the Harris Mill contained up and down saws in them, and there's a picture of an up and down type of a saw in this slide. Now, this took a lot longer to produce the lumber, so it was converted later to circular saws in the Harris Mill, and that was a lot quicker to produce the wood that they needed. Now, the means to power these mills was water, and the water was diverted from the Towanda Creek through a channel to a mill pond and then sent to a water wheel at the mill. The turning of the water wheel created the power to run the saw, and due to the unreliability of water, all of these mills eventually changed over to steam engines. Now, on the south side of the Towanda Creek in LeRoy was another combination grist mill and sawmill, and this was located on what is now Mitzsteifer Loop, and the building is no longer there. It was torn down in 1997. But Eli Holcomb built a grist mill here in 1827 and then rebuilt it in 1852. And in 1869, the mill was passed to Eli's son LeRoy Holcomb, who added a sawmill to the building and continued to operate it until the early 1900s. The water power for the mill was created by damming a swamp at the top of the mountain and controlling the water with stone walls as it descended the mountain. It then collected in a mill pond at the bottom to operate a water wheel at the mill. This mill was later converted to steam power, and also a shingle mill was found just down the creek from this site. This map that's also shown next to the picture shows Holcomb's pond and the stream running down, and you'll see at the top of the map, which would be actually the bottom of the mountain, you'll see Matthew Mott's tannery there, and you'll see E. Holcomb grist mill at that location, and that's where the sawmill / grist mill was located. In his case, and in the case of many grist mill operators, it's not an operation that would run year-round, and so in order to continue to make money at other times of the year, it was profitable to have a sawmill connected with your operation, so you could be doing sawmilling at one time and grist milling at another time. Now, up on the mountain in LeRoy Township, on the part of the mountain known as South Mountain, was Cold Spring, and the Cold Spring settlement on the South Mountain in LeRoy was first settled in 1841, and a sawmill was built there along the Schrader Creek, operated by William Porter. And you can see the location of William Porter's place there in this map that's shown. And below it, you can also see William Porter's sawmill identified along the Schrader Creek. Hezekiah Wilcox operated a steam-powered sawmill at the base of the mountain along the road leading down from the Cold Spring settlement, and that road connected with what is now Southside Road, but the road is now impassable. In those days, however, the road went straight up over the mountain from Southside Road down to the southern part of the township where this settlement and these mills could be found. So these early operations usually only cut down the largest trees, and back then hemlock had no value, and so they would only cut down the trees, strip the bark off, send that to the tanneries, and just leave the large logs to just lay on the ground and rot. And so a lot of trees were wasted in that way. At Barclay, even though Barclay was a coal mining town, they had a sawmill at that location because they needed lumber, of course, to build buildings there. But more importantly, they needed lumber to provide props and all of the necessary lumber down inside the mines. So in this map of Barclay, you can see the sawmill identified, and there's a red arrow pointing to it. It's also, again, located along a stream. And in the picture there, which is one of the few pictures of Barclay that exists, is actually a drawing. You can see the sawmill with a smokestack sticking up out of it, located in the left side of that photo. In Canton, we also had lumbering going on. The largest operation in the area was Crawford's Mill, And this was a sawmill started by Hugh Crawford in 1885. In addition to the mill on what is now South Center Street in Canton, Crawford had 3 portable sawmills, one at Maston, one on the Tioga River, and one on the South Mountain. After the death of Hugh Crawford, his sons Charles and Byron took over the operation. The mill in Canton burned first in 1895 and again in 1962 when the company went out of business. So you can see pictures of the mill there as well as the log yard, and you can see the massive logs that are piled there in the yard. A Civil War soldier, Giles M. Coons, started in the lumber business in 1870 and continually expanded his operations to not only produce lumber, but also he built a sash and blind factory and a planing mill. Aside from Hugh Crawford, Giles Coons once had one of the largest lumber operations in Canton, and his mill was located on the west side of Troy Street, where the Canton Post Office is now located. So here you can see an image of Giles Coons that was in the newspaper, as well as some ads for his lumber business. Also, Canton had numerous factories that made use of lumber, including the Canton Couch Company, the Sheldon Manufacturing Company, the Belmar Manufacturing Company, H. Taylor Planing Mill, and others. And railcar loads of wood products were shipped from Canton each week. So you can see in the upper left is the Canton Couch Company, which started out making furniture, later made phonographs. On the upper right is the Belmar plant, where hangers were made and wood was used in the production of those. In the lower right corner is the Sheldon Manufacturing Company, and then the railroad station at the bottom. Now, returning back to the topic of the Lewis brothers, as all this was going on in LeRoy, a family had moved into LeRoy in the mid-1800s named the Lewis family. And Oakley Lewis was the father. He was married to Anne Bloom Lewis, and the family lived just west of LeRoy. Now, Oakley would ultimately build the house and the farm that's located here, but he and his wife once lived across the street in another house before building this one. This is a picture of the Lewis family all together, including the Lewis brothers. You'll see the Lewis brothers are located in the middle row, which we will look at closer in a minute and identify them. But you'll see their mother, Anne, sitting in the center in the second row, and others, various relatives of the family there. On the left, take notice of the girl sitting on the pony. We'll mention her a little bit later as well. The Lewis brothers started out when a man by the name of Chauncey A. Kelly, who was a former lumberman and store owner in LeRoy, gave the Lewis brothers $200 to start a sawmill. Chauncey Kelly was somewhat of an investor, and so the 3 brothers were young at that time, and they started off a lumber business with this $200. This is a close-up of each of the Lewis brothers that's shown in that previous picture we looked at of the family together. On the left is George Lewis, in the middle is Harrison Lewis, and on the right is E. Lloyd Lewis. That made up the 3 Lewis brothers. Now, George on the left would be the man who would operate the store business in the building that the Lewis brothers would build in LeRoy. Harrison Lewis would be the woods boss. He'd be the guy up on the mountain running the lumber operation. And Lloyd Lewis was more on the agricultural side of things. Now, when the Lewis brothers started out, they had with them their brother-in-law, who's shown here, H.L. Stone, who went by his middle name Lewis. So Lewis Stone was married to Bertha Lewis, who's shown here. Bertha is a sister of the Lewis brothers. So the 3 Lewis brothers and their brother-in-law, Lewis Stone, started out together in business. And there's a legal notice in 1891 that discusses the dissolution of the partnership of the Lewis brothers and Stone, because Lewis Stone was moving and going to go into business doing something in Sullivan County. But it's worth remembering Lewis Stone, because Lewis and his wife once lived in the hotel and operated the hotel portion of the business when it was later built. So the Lewis brothers started out around 1887, but one of the first newspaper accounts of their work comes in 1892, when it was reported that they had 14 teams of horses hauling lumber from their mill near the marsh to Foot of Plain. Now, the marsh they're talking about is Cranberry Marsh up on the hill, up on the mountain in LeRoy, and Cranberry Marsh can be seen on this geological survey map. And so they started lumbering there around Cranberry Marsh, and they moved their way across the mountain, lumbering around Sunfish Pond, and ultimately winding up over at Carbon Run. So the red arrows point in the direction that they moved in cutting the timber. Now, 1895 is the first recording in the newspaper of them being at Carbon Run. Now, they had a portable sawmill, so they were able to move their mill as needed, and from 1895 on, until they would finish up, they would be at Carbon Run. Now, the Lewis brothers hired a number of men who would work in the woods for them, and they would cut down the trees, they would peel off the bark, and the bark would go to the tanneries. And one of the main places where it would go was Granville Center, where there was a tannery, but the bark from their last job at Carbon Run was hauled to Foot of Plain and sent to the Greenwood Tannery at what we now know as Powell. So this is an actual picture of the Lewis brothers operation, hauling bark down off of the mountain. I'd like to give credit to the Tioga Point Museum. This is where we found this image, and we were very grateful to come across this. It's a fascinating photo. More recently, we found a couple more pictures of the Lewis bark hauling operation, if you might call it that. And you can see the wagons that they're hauling on, very similar. Just imagine hauling this down over the mountain, considering the rough roads that existed at that time, taking that down over the mountain into LeRoy and up over into Granville Center. This is another view of several loads of bark lined up and ready to go. So these were probably taken around the 1890s, we figure, considering the other pictures that we found them with. And we'd like to give the McKean family credit for this set of photos. Now, the bark was going down to Granville Center, and the tannery at Granville Center was owned by the Innes family. And this is a picture of the family there at the left, and their father was Adam Innes, who is shown there on the right. Adam is the one who built the tannery. It was called the Scotia Tannery, and this is an image of the tannery as it appeared in Kraft's 1878 History of Bradford County. You can see that it was a pretty extensive operation there in Granville Center. You can still see the location of the tannery today. The house over there on the left, which is just on the right side of the road, but to the left of the picture, that house still exists today, but all of the buildings located behind do not exist. So there was quite an operation set up there at Granville Center. And the purpose of a tannery, you have to remember, is to create leather. In order to make the leather, you needed to have tannin, and that could be found easily and cheaply in hemlock bark. And from that, you can make tannic acid, which was needed in the process in the tannery. This is a picture of Lewis Brothers Sawmill located at Carbon Run. You can see, again, it's a portable sawmill, and it's built in such a way as it could be torn apart and moved on to a different location if necessary. The newspaper reported that the mill burned in June of 1895 and then was rebuilt by the end of July 1895. So we're not sure exactly whether this is the mill as it appeared before or after the fire, but nevertheless, it is a very good picture showing the employees of the Lewis brothers who were operating the mill at the time. This is another picture also at the mill, and a more close-up view, and in this one we have employees standing there inside the mill, and you can see some of the equipment of the mill in the background. It was in this mill that the lumber that they would ultimately build their hotel with was created. And this is another view of their mill located on the mountain. Now, they were hauling their lumber to the Foot of Plain there at Barclay and then shipping it by rail car out. And so in later years, the lumber was stacked at Barclay and then was sent down the inclined plane using the old gravity-operated plane cars. And so that's how they got their product to market. Of course, local sales down in LeRoy, they probably hauled down off the mountain that direction. Of course, the lumber that they needed to build their hotel building needed to be hauled down in that direction as well. In 1896, beginning in May, they built the Lewis House, and this is a picture of it. It was opened to the public on October 12th, and a grand ball was held to open the building officially on October 20th with the Marks and Whitman Orchestra of Canton providing the music. Now, this was quite a building. First of all, it's built entirely with lumber from Barclay Mountain. The woodwork inside was created at the planing mill that belonged to Rancy Morse that was located just down the street. I showed you that on the map earlier in the video. To explain a little bit about this building and how it's laid out by looking at this picture, first of all, you can see on the left side, the portion underneath the gable end there. On the ground, you see a man standing on the porch, and there's kind of three sections to the porch. And that is the Lewis Brothers General Merchandise Store. It was like the Walmart of LeRoy, is what I call it at that time. And you can get just about anything from household goods to farm products, hay, of course, lumber could be ordered through there. Just all sorts of things were available at the Lewis Brothers store. And just above that, where there were three windows right in a row, you had a ballroom in that location. So that was used for public entertainments. But later it was turned into a second department for the store as the store needed more space. A stairway was built up the back wall in the corner, which I've shown evidence of in other videos that I've made. And that was used for more products that they had for sale. And of course, above that is the attic space. Although it was made up to look like it was another third floor that was merely just an attic. So over in the center, you'll see a sign that's hanging down in the archway, and that says Lewis House, H.L. Stone Proprietor. And we'll look at that in a different picture a little close up, but that is the entrance to the hotel. Above that is a window for the main stairway, main hallway, and then there's a tower above that, which again is part of the attic, but it was an interesting place where you could get a really good view of the valley of LeRoy. And then everything over to the right is all part of either the hotel portion of the building or the living quarters for the hotel proprietor, which is located more toward the back of the building. Toward the back is a hotel dining room. So if you got off the stagecoach here, you could go in and you could get something to eat in the hotel dining room. And of course, there's also a door in between the hotel and the store. So if you wanted to do some shopping while you were there, you could go over next door and do some shopping in the store and mail something in the post office that was also located in that room before you left. Of course, there's a large veranda across the front with a gazebo-like feature on the right side. All of that is now gone today. Up on the roof toward the right side of the building, there's a dormer window sticking out. That's been taken out. And the chimney that sticks up above it has been taken out. Otherwise, it looks very, very similar today as it did back then. The hotel also had a barn that was built in 1900. I assume that you could keep your horses or your carriage or whatever if you happen to be driving through and staying at the hotel. You could keep them there in the barn. But they also sold hay and they sold products out of the barn, I believe. And so in these pictures, you can see a picture of the Lewis Brothers barn that was located. On the left is part of a postcard picture, and that little section of the barn is all you can see. And on the right is a extremely zoomed in glass plate negative where you can see the barn sticking up. It's sticking up basically where the parking area is on the property today. And immediately behind the house, you'll see that there's a building that's built into the side bank. And that's an interesting feature that I haven't been able to identify, but I suspect, given its location right behind the general store portion of the building, I suspect that is an ice house, perhaps, in which they had cold storage for eggs and everything that they needed to sell in the store. They shipped a lot of eggs and butter and things out of this store, and so I'm assuming that that had something to do with that. Now, when you zoom into that first picture we looked at, you get a good idea of the store entrance. In fact, you can see right into the store front windows and see some of the products for sale that are on display there. I see some oil lamps, and there's some clothing, and so on, and that's all available there. So there were large display windows there, and then there were double doors that were inset in the middle. As we've done the renovation at the building, you can still today see where the inset doors were, and we have identified that on the ceiling in the room that will be an exhibit room in the future. and so we'll always be able to see where the front doors had been located in that room. Of course, then I mentioned before the entrance to the hotel there at the right, and you can see that there were double doors there, screen doors you can see in this picture, and then further doors inside. You can also notice that underneath the main archway where the Lewis House sign is, down on the step, it says hotel there. There's also a step there in the center, and this was a stagecoach stop, and so as the stagecoach came through, they could stop at that large step there in the center, and people would be able to step out of the stagecoach and right up onto the porch. And that was a very handy setup that they had created. Now, zooming in as far as we can see the two signs on the building: Lewis Brothers and Company General Merchants, that was the store, and then Lewis House, H.L. Stone Proprietor is the sign that hangs from the center archway above the front door. Now, this is a picture of the Lewis House looking from the right side or the east side of the house. You can see better now the gazebo feature on the end of the porch, and other interesting things that you can see as you zoom in are letters along the base of the gazebo that say Hotel Lewis. There's also a small American flag hanging to the left of the side first floor window, and you can see the features on the back porch, many of which are gone today. We still have the parts that go on there, but the only thing on there right now is the original porch posts. But otherwise, again, except for the dormer roof, or the dormer window in the roof and the chimney on top, the building still looks very much the same way, still to this day. And then another picture, probably taken around 1912, or in that area. This was a postcard image, so it's hand color. That's why the roof is red. But this is an interesting picture because in this case, unlike the other two, this was taken after the addition was added on the left or the west side of the house. Now, this addition was a lumber office that was added in 1906, according to the newspaper. By this time, the Lewis brothers were off the mountain, and they had lumber interests in other parts of the county and also in other parts of the country, in other states, in fact. And so they needed a place that they could handle their lumber books and so on, because in 1906, the Lewis Brothers firm dissolved their business as far as the store was located, and that was turned over to Mr. and Mrs. Ray Manley. And so I'm assuming that that means that they built this office in order to have a place now outside of the store where these records could be kept. I'm assuming that probably before the records were all kept together in the same location, if not at the home of one of the brothers. But it appears that there was no door in between the store and this room. It looks like this is a separately entered space. You can see that there was a door in the front and a door in the back, and additional windows there. Also, a chimney is coming up out of there, so there are independently heating that space as well from the rest of the house. There wouldn't have been a basement under this as there is under the rest of the house, so the furnace that heated the rest of the house at that time would not have extended into this room. This is a very simple outline of the layout of the building. It's unclear in some cases what the back portion of the first floor looked like, where the kitchen area is, because that was somewhat changed over the years. But nevertheless, we can get an idea of how things were laid out here. As I already mentioned, the Lewis Brothers General Merchandise store was on the left side of the building. You can see the hotel entry and the main stairs, which then entered into a hotel dining room. And then a kitchen area was connected with that at the back. There was a pass-through area where you could pass through dishes into a small portion of the kitchen where there was a sink, and you could wash the dishes right there. Two windows looking out the back of the dining room, and it appears that the hotel proprietor and his wife lived in the back portion. There's a separate back stairway that went up to some bedrooms that were separate off the main hallway of the building. And so we believe that the hotel proprietor lived in the back. There was a separate entrance, a separate porch back there, a little sunroom kind of place for them, and it connected into the front rooms of the building. Now, whether those front first floor rooms were used by the family or whether they were available to the public, it's unknown, but there are pocket doors in between those two front rooms. On the second floor is the ballroom above the store, again the hallway, and then guest rooms in the front along the main hallway, and then there used to be a separate hallway then turning toward the back of the house that went toward rooms that I believe were once hotel proprietor bedrooms. This is an image of the main stairway in the building. It still looks as original as it did when the building was first built. Some other images of the stairway. These were taken several years ago in the early 2000s. And then the ballroom in the building, which is located on the second floor. This is the room where it was originally used for dances. There was a grand ball here when the building first opened. Later on, this became a second department for the store. What's interesting is the woodwork that's featured here all around on the ceiling, on the walls and floor and everywhere. And considering that this lumber all came from the mountain, that makes this room quite a special room in the building. The room was once heated independently by probably a small stove there. We can see the outline of where there was a stovepipe hooked up to that chimney. That's the main chimney that runs clear from the basement up through the ceiling to the attic, but this room probably had its own stove at one time. In the ballroom, usually the LeRoy Silver Cornet Band played, and they provided music for the dances sometimes that were held there. This is a picture of the band located there on the left, and on the right is a picture of my third great grandparents, Matthew Holcomb, who is dressed in his LeRoy Silver Cornet Band uniform, and then his girlfriend at the time, they hadn't gotten married yet, Ora Thomas, and that picture was taken at the Canton Fair in 1899, not long before they were married in the following year. But they most likely met in the hotel. She was working in the hotel for the Lewises at the time, and he was a blacksmith just down the street, and in his spare time played in the band in the ballroom at the hotel. So it's quite likely that the two probably met as a result of the hotel building. These are some ads and bills in this and in the following slides pertaining to the Lewises. The one on the left here is an ad, full-page ad, that appeared in the Bradford County directory for 1900. Obviously, they were doing quite well that year to have taken out a full-page ad. That was kind of a rarity in that publication. So the top portion of the ad talks about their lumber business. They are manufacturers and shippers of hemlock and hardwood lumber and lath, shipping station at Foot of Plain, mills at Carbon Run, office at LeRoy, general store at LeRoy, agricultural implements, wagons, etc. And then the next section down on the ad in the center is for the store that was located in the hotel, Lewis Brothers and Company, dealers in dry goods, groceries, boots, and shoes. Agricultural implements, wagons, etc., country produce taken at the highest market price. And then at the bottom is the ad for the hotel, which was managed by H.L. Stone at the time. It says, house is heated by furnace, all accommodations first class, and rates are $1 per day. To the right is a receipt for the Lewis house, also known as the Hotel Lewis. Again, rates $1 per day and good accommodations. So that particular receipt is dated the same year that the hotel opened, which is an interesting item. These are a number of different receipts that were made up by the Lewis Brothers Lumber Company. And finally, receipts from the store, Lewis Brothers General Merchandise, and they also advertise on the store, manufacturers and shippers of hardwood and hemlock lumber, buyers and shippers, Bradford County butter and eggs. And of course, long-distance telephone is available, which is something that wasn't available anywhere else in town at the time. The Lewis House was the first building in town to have electricity. They had a 32-volt electric light plant originally in the basement of the hotel, and later a gasoline engine was located in the basement of Lloyd Lewis's house. And all of the Lewis Brothers houses and the hotel were all connected together and had electricity long before anyone else in town had electric. So this picture here shows some of the porcelain knobs and lighting fixture mounts that were located in the ceiling of the old store inside the hotel. And these are much larger knobs and things because I'm assuming they're a lot older than the knobs that came later that you pounded in with a hammer and nail. These here were screwed in by hand, and the wires for the lights in the ceiling were ran along the surface of the ceiling. And so it was very interesting how that was done to light up the store. and the hotel also had lights as well. The Lewises were also engaged in the Glenbrook Water Company, and this was a private water company in which several local men here that were neighbors of the Lewis Brothers Hotel got together, and they created a water company in order to provide water for all of the buildings and houses that they were associated with in the center of LeRoy. And there's a creek that flows down through LeRoy, at one time called Gulf Brook, and at another time it was called Glenbrook. And so the Glenbrook Water Company was located here in the center of town. Now, they had a building up along the creek, up on the hill in back of the hotel, and water went into that well and then was piped down over the hill down to the hotel and also to a watering trough on Main Street, and then also to the houses of the families who were partners in this water company, and it was used for a number of years in that way. There's still a valve sticking out of the wall in the basement of the old hotel building where the water used to come down and come into the basement of the building. Also, George Lewis was involved in starting the LeRoy Telephone Company. George Lewis, Rancy Morse, and Ernest Holcomb were all businessmen here in LeRoy, and they started the company in 1912, and this company would later merge with the Canton Telephone Company and become the Canton and LeRoy Farmers Telephone Company. In this advertisement that was in the Canton Sentinel, you can see that Lewis Brothers and Mrs. Harrison Lewis and E. Lloyd Lewis all are listed as people who are available by phone to be able to be called from Canton. Now, looking at the Lewis properties in the Valley of LeRoy and where they were located, you can see they were spread out through town. The original house that was built by Oakley Lewis is shown there in the center at the bottom of the picture. That house is still there. In more recent years, it's been lived in by Lloyd Wilcox. And then across the road from that is the house and farm that he later built, which is identified as the Oakley Lewis farm in this picture. Although the barn there is gone, the house still stands. And then down the road, you can see the location of Harrison Lewis's house, the hotel, George Lewis's house, and then Lloyd Lewis's house and barn all together there in town. So let's take a closer look at these different properties that I've pointed out here. First of all, this is Lloyd Lewis's house. This was built by his father-in-law, Robert Mason, in about 1880, and it later burned in 1973. It was in the basement of this house that in 1911 Lloyd Lewis had an electric light plant put in, and it was powered with gasoline, as can be seen by the article here, and the wires ran down the street and connected all of the Lewis houses and the hotel all together. Just down the street from Lloyd and not quite to the hotel, you can see the hotel there in the distance on the left. Right where the red arrow is pointing was George Lewis's house. And he broke ground for his house in April of 1900. That house, again, is still there today. And I put this article in the bottom left corner from 1912 referencing George Lewis purchasing a Cadillac, simply because there's a car in this photo, which was a very unusual thing in LeRoy. The picture taken here was probably taken around maybe 1910 to 1912 era. So to have a car on the street there at that time was very strange, to say the least, for the people who were using horse and buggy still in this valley. This is what George Lewis's house looks like today. It's been beautifully saved and updated and still in use today. Now, if you look at the lower right corner of where the porch is located there, the next picture I'm going to show was taken about that location. Of course, the porch looks different now than it did back then, but this is where this next picture was taken. Here you can see the front corner of the right side of the porch at that time. And these are two children of George Lewis. This is Leah standing there, and then Charlie, who's up on the pony. Now, if you remember back to the picture that I showed of the whole Lewis family standing together, you saw Leah, dressed very similar, sitting up on the pony there, next to George Lewis. And then here is the pony again with Charlie sitting on it to the right. So that's an interesting couple of pictures there. Now, these pictures were taken inside what was the George Lewis house. They were taken in more recent years when the Chapel family restored the house, and this is showing the stairway inside the house. And what's interesting about it is that it is very similar in design to the stairway inside the hotel. It's not exactly the same, but you can see the four sticks with the ball on each end at each level going up the stairway is the same type of design as the stairs in the hotel. This was Harrison Lewis's house. This is located in the center of LeRoy. He purchased his house from Dr. Charles Haynes, who had built the house. Harrison moved into here in April of 1900. This is what the house looks like today. It's still standing, again, without its front porch. And in more recent years, this house burned and then was later restored. And so much of the inside was changed and doesn't quite look the same as it originally did. Now, in 1901, the Lewis brothers bid on a lumber contract with the Union Tanning Company, and they were one of several who were bidding on the project. Now, the Lewis brothers had done work with the Union Tanning Company before. In 1899, the Lewis brothers contracted to furnish the Union Tanning Company with about 1,500 tons of bark. Then they purchased the logs to use for lumber. So they, not too long in the past, before this, had already worked with the tanning company. In this job, they were bidding for a much larger project, however, and this was going to be cutting thousands and thousands of potential board feet of lumber from off the mountain. Much bigger project than the Lewises had ever taken on to date. And so there were many people who were trying to get the contract to do this, and some of them are mentioned in the article here to the left. It said the bids have been asked by the tanning company from several parties, among them being the Lewis brothers of LeRoy, Clark, Kipp, and Kaiser of Punxsutawney, and Albert Lewis, the lumber king of Wilkes-Barre. The deal will probably be closed within a week or two. And then at the right, the Wellsboro Gazette reported that Towanda is interested in the fact that perhaps the logs may be shipped to that borough to be manufactured. Albert Lewis is shown here in this picture, and he had quite an operation of his own, and certainly could have handled this project. Clark, Kipp, and Kaiser, they had a lumber company in Jefferson County, Pennsylvania, that purchased vast tracts of timber in McCalmont, Oliver, and Young townships, where they operated sawmills. So the partnership was made up of Daniel H. Clark. Daniel Clark was active in banking, construction, manufacturing, and was a prime mover in establishing the street railway systems through the Mahoning Valley, connecting Punxsutawney, Reynoldsville, Sykesville, and the coal towns and villages in between. He was also instrumental in starting the Indiana County Street Railway Company. And then G.W. Kipp and E. Floyd Kaiser. Kipp is shown there at the right. Active in politics in Wayne County, Kipp came to Bradford County to engage in lumbering, then to Sullivan County for the same reason. He had a residence in Monroeton, and Kipp ultimately moved to Jefferson County and established a lumber mill, but he still had investments in Towanda, including the Towanda Water Works, in partnership with his brother-in-law E. Floyd Kaiser. Kaiser was also a bank director in Towanda and president of the Jefferson Traction Company. So these were men of means who were bidding on this project. Then it was advertised in 1902 that the contract had been given to the Barclay brothers of Cinemahoning. Even though it was felt that some local company would probably be given the contract, that ended up not being the case. And the Barclay brothers, no relation that we know of to the Barclays who owned Barclay Mountain, the Barclay brothers received the contract, and work was going to be done by them. Now, they had experience in lumbering from where they came from. The Barclay brothers were from Cinemahoning. The partnership was made up of George A. Barclay, the father, in the center, and his sons, Charles F. Barclay and Watson L. Barclay, located on either side of this picture. And that made up the Barclay firm. And they had done a lot of lumbering down around Cinemahoning and Cameron County. Now, as a result, the Lewis brothers lost the bid on this project, and that left them with stacks of lumber piled up at Carbon Run, which they now needed to sell because they had sawed everything they could in the part of the mountain that they were working, and they now needed to move on to a new location if they wanted to continue their lumbering business. So it happened to be then that the new company that was going to be located on the mountain was going to need lumber in order to set up their new sawmill, and who better to sell that lumber to them than the Lewis Brothers Lumber Company, who had it stockpiled at Carbon Run right up over the hill from Laquin. So that lumber was sold to the Barclays, and that lumber was hauled down over the mountain by wagon down to Laquin, and that is where they built the new mill there. Of course, once the mill at Laquin was built by the Barclays, they could produce their own lumber and build the rest of the buildings that they needed. But that's how that worked out. The interesting thing is this picture here, which shows Carbon Run, and you can see lumber stacked there. It's unknown whether that was part of the Lewis's or not, but the Lewis mill would have been toward the back of this picture up behind this group of houses. So the Lewis brothers were looking for a new place to lumber. And so this article in 1903 said that Lewis brothers of LeRoy and Ellenberger and Yeager of Towanda closed a deal on Tuesday by which the former purchased 2,500 acres of timberland in Virginia. The sum of $25,000 was paid by the purchasers, but the amount involved is considerably more than this. Lewis brothers expect to move to Virginia in the spring and will at once begin the manufacture of the immense tract. So now they are going to move the operation. They're going to take their mill and their equipment. They're going to put it on rail cars along with everything that they need, horses and men and everything. And they're going to put it on the railroad, and they're going to take it by special train down to West Virginia. This article in 1903 says Harrison Lewis of LeRoy, of the well-known firm of Lewis Brothers, has returned from West Virginia, where he bought a timber tract with 2,500 acres of land in Pocahontas and Randolph counties, and will move the mill from Carbon Run and take some of the teams and men down there as soon as the work is done up at Carbon Run. In 1903, it said Lewis Stone, who formerly conducted Lewis Brothers' store at LeRoy, has purchased a quarter interest in their lumber job in West Virginia and expects to move his family there this summer. So Lewis is now back with the brothers in a partnership again. So this was the Lewis Brothers Mill at Glady, West Virginia. This was located near Elkins. Elkins was sort of the main town that was located nearby. Glady was more of a remote area, remote town at the time. But there's a lumber boom that was going on in West Virginia at that time, and a number of companies were coming in there. And it's kind of a Wild West atmosphere at that time, very different from the places they had come from here in Pennsylvania. And so over the next several months in 1903, there was a number of announcements of people who were leaving LeRoy and getting on the railroad at Canton and traveling down to West Virginia to work in the Lewis Brothers camp. There were, however, also a number of injuries and deaths that occurred once the Lewises got down there. In October of 1904, it was announced that Charlie Mott of LeRoy was accidentally killed at Glady, West Virginia, Monday morning. His remains were brought here Tuesday, and funeral services were held Thursday. The Canton Sentinel reported a distressing accident occurred at Glady, West Virginia last Sunday, resulting in the death of Charles Mott of LeRoy. While walking along the mountain, he fell down a railroad cut 125 feet deep, death resulting instantly. The young man was about 27 years of age and was a son of Mrs. Lucinda Mott of LeRoy. He was in the employ of Lewis Brothers. The remains were brought to the home of his mother in LeRoy, where the funeral was held yesterday afternoon. In 1905, another accident. In March, Fred Irvin, aged 32, employed by the Lewis Brothers Lumber Company at Glady on the Coal and Iron Railway, was caught between two cars on a log train on the Coal and Iron Railway near Glady and instantly killed. Now I want to look for a minute at the conditions in Glady, West Virginia at that time. The picture here shows that area as it looks today, but Glady was not a great place to live at the time. Some histories of the area indicate, number one, there were several other lumbering outfits in the area at the time, many of whom employed rough characters, and some even criminals. In addition, there was a mix of cultures, including large Italian and African American work camps. Number two, Glady was a bustling lumber town complete with sawmill stores, saloons, restaurants, hotels, barber shops, and a slaughterhouse. By the time Glady was incorporated in 1907, it had a population of 400. Number three, the mix of cultures, low pay, poor working conditions, and free-flowing liquor made Glady a rough place to live. Between 1901 and 1909, there were 4 and possibly 5 people lynched in Randolph County. In the 3 years previous to the Lewis brothers' arrival, there were 21 murders. It was common to witness shootouts at the local saloon or fighting on the streets, and between these conditions and a number of accidents and deaths, and the lumber not meeting their expectations, the Lewis Brothers Lumber Company ultimately returned to LeRoy. So as far as I've ever been able to tell, the Lewis brothers were not in West Virginia for too long. because by 1906, we find evidence that the brothers had returned back home and were looking at other operations closer to home that they potentially could invest in. In March of 1906, it said George and Lloyd Lewis of the firm of Lewis Brothers, along with Sam Mott, were down the river in Bradford County looking after timber tracts. And in May of 1906, once the Lewis brothers had returned to the area, they now had a new automobile, which was the first one in LeRoy. Also, upon returning, they would build the annex for their new lumber office that I previously mentioned. And it was at this time, I believe, that they were now getting ready to do other lumber operations in the area. And so they needed a place to store these records and do this work. So they next looked to the eastern part of Bradford County as a place to do lumbering. And later, again in the year, they were in the Laraysville area purchasing a farm which they intended to lumber off. And they also were investing in a large tract of timber in Florida, along with Giles M. Coons of Canton. And they were making preparation to develop that. Mr. Coons was doing the work, I believe, and he was going down there to superintend the operation, but the Lewis brothers were investing in it. In 1911, it said Willis Hoagland, who has a 2-year contract with Lewis Brothers at Kerwinsville, came home last Saturday to spend a couple of days with his family. And so now they're in a different location altogether by 1911. But also in 1911, as I mentioned, Lloyd Lewis upgraded the electrical system for all of the Lewis properties. And then in December of 1911, it was reported that LeRoy also has a Lewis Opera House. The spacious rooms over the Lewis Brothers store have been properly fitted for public meetings and entertainments and is known under the caption given above. In 1911, the ballroom was put back into use as a public meeting space and was called the Lewis Opera House, not to be confused with the Lewis Opera House that was built around the same time at Canton. And soon enough, there were some plays that were done there and also some other entertainments. And I believe that the school graduations were then at that time held in that ballroom. George Lewis would ultimately move to Canton. In 1912, he formed, along with Louis McFadden and a man named M.J. McNerney, a company called the McNerney Construction Company, which was intended to carry on a general engineering business constructing roads, bridges, railroads, etc. Of course, Louis McFadden ended up running for Congress, and his opponents would use a project that was done by the McNerney Construction Company against him. Supposedly, it was done very badly, and George, as the president, George Lewis, would write quite a lengthy letter in the Canton Sentinel outlining the truth about the situation and correcting a lot of the misinformation that had been put out by the opponent. In 1913, we know that the Lewis brothers now were at Whitney Point, New York, because there was an announcement that Gerald Griswold Bishop, age 19, the son of Mrs. Isidore Bishop of LeRoy Township, was instantly killed Tuesday afternoon, March 11th, by being thrown against a rapidly revolving saw while at work in a mill near Whitney Point, New York. The mill is a new one built by Lewis brothers of LeRoy and only started Tuesday morning, the terrible accident occurring during the first day's run. Young Bishop left his home in LeRoy last Friday to go to his new field of labor. He was a young man with many friends and very popular. The remains were brought to this place Wednesday on the 11:19 a.m. train and taken to his mother's home at LeRoy, where the funeral was held Thursday afternoon. In 1914, Lloyd Lewis was involved in helping start the Canton Mercantile Company, which was said the character and object of which is buying, selling, and trading or dealing at wholesale and retail in feed, coal, fertilizer, hay, grain, grass, seed, potatoes, fruit, farming implements, hardware, groceries, clothing, dairy products, and all articles of a similar or cognate character. Following year, 1915, their brother Harrison Lewis passed away. Harrison again was the woods boss. He was 59 years old, and he was the oldest of the three sons. 2 years later, he was followed in death by George Lewis, who was only 52 years old, and he passed away in March. When George moved to Canton, his house was located on Main Street. George was a director of the First National Bank of Canton, vice president of the Grange National Bank of Troy, a large stockholder in the Swayze Advertising Company, the McNerney Construction Company, and the H.L. Stone Lumber Company of Elmira, in addition to his interests in the firm of Lewis Brothers. And E. Lloyd Lewis died in 1944 at the age of 72. He was the director of the First National Bank of Canton, the Canton and LeRoy Farmers Telephone Company, and was a member of the LeRoy Church of Christ. He had previously been a director of the Farmers National Bank in Canton before it closed. And today, this is a picture of the Lewis Hotel. As I mentioned previously, some of the architectural features are gone, but it's very much the same. The LeRoy Heritage Museum is restoring the building and converting it for use as a new museum covering the history of southwestern Bradford County, including the history of the mountain. So thank you again for joining me today to learn a little bit about the Lewis brothers and their work in southwestern Bradford County. For more information about the building project, you can go to our website at leroyheritage.org, and in the menu find Expansion Project. Click on there and you'll find more information about it. If you're interested in making a contribution to the project, there are various ways in which you can do that, and various size donations are acknowledged in different ways. And you can find that information there on our website. You can also make the donation directly through the website if you wish. So we thank you for your interest in the project. Thank you again for joining us.